Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan dan salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Selamat siang Bapak Ibu tamu undangan serta hadirin yang berbahagia. Izinkan saya menyambut tamu undangan terlebih dahulu. Yang terhormat Direktur Universitas Katolik Indonesia Atmajaya Public of Policy, Bapak Salvatore Simamarta. Yang saya hormati Ketua Departemen Sosiologi Universitas Indonesia Profesor Dr. Indra Ratna Irawati Patina Saharani. Yang saya hormati Bapak Ibu dosen Universitas Katolik Indonesia Atmajaya, serta hadirin dan teman-teman yang saya sayangi yang tidak dapat saya sebutkan satu persatu. Saya ucapkan terima kasih atas kehadirannya dan selamat datang pada acara Forum Semanggi 4 Oligarchy and the End of the Reformasi in Indonesia for Power Reorganized. Forum Semanggi adalah ruang refleksi, perjumpaan ide, dan pemikiran alternatif dalam ekosistem public engagement Atmajaya Institute of Public Policy. Forum ini mendorong keberanian membayangkan kemungkinan-kemungkinan yang belum terpikirkan jauh tekanan dari arus utama. Bapak Ibu serta hadirin yang berbahagia, puji syukur kita panjatkan kehadiran Tuhan Yang Maha Esa karena atas karunia-Nya kita dapat hadir pada acara hari ini. Oleh karena itu, izinkan saya untuk memperkenalkan diri. Saya Rehan Riyadi dari Program Studi Ilmu Hukum Universitas Katolik Indonesia Atmajaya selaku pemandu acara pada hari ini. Untuk mengawali kegiatan, marilah kita bersama-sama menyanyikan lagu kebangsaan Indonesia Raya. Kepada seluruh hadirin, saya mohon untuk berdiri. Terima kasih setelah bersama-sama menyanyikan lagu kebangsaan Indonesia Raya. Sebelum melanjutkan rangkaian acara selanjutnya, izinkan saya untuk menyampaikan panduan ruang aman. Acara ini adalah ruang terbuka untuk berekspresi dan juga berdiskusi. Demi menjaga kenyamanan bersama, mohon untuk menghargai setiap peserta dan setiap pendapat yang disampaikan. Menjaga bahasa tetap sopan dan tidak provokatif, menghindari ujaran yang menyinggung sara dan diskriminatif, dan tidak melakukan intimidasi, ancaman, atau kekerasan dalam bentuk apapun. Apabila Anda mengalami atau menyaksikan perilaku yang tidak pantas, silakan melaporkan kepada panitia. Terima kasih sudah membantu untuk menciptakan ruang yang aman, inklusif, dan nyaman untuk semuanya. Memasuki acara selanjutnya, marilah kita simak sambutan dari Direktur Atmajaya Institute of Public Policy. Berikan tepuk tangan yang meriah kepada Bapak Salvatore Simamarta, saya persilakan.
Cek. Ya baik, terima kasih. Selamat siang Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan mahasiswa. Selamat siang. Baik, kayaknya setelah makan malah tambah lesu ya, karena mungkin jam-jam rawan istilahnya. Pertama-tama terima kasih kepada Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan sekalian yang sudah hadir di forum Semanggi keempat ini. Selamat datang di Unika Atmajaya. Dan acara ini menjadi salah satu agenda kita di Institute of Public Policy Universitas Katolik Indonesia Atmajaya. Semoga Bapak Ibu dan rekan-rekan merasa nyaman untuk terlibat dan berdiskusi di acara ini. Sebagai pengantar, selama ini kita sudah cukup terbiasa membayangkan bahwa demokrasi dan oligarki itu dua hal yang sudah pasti akan saling meniadakan gitu. Bahwa kalau semakin demokratis suatu bangsa, maka kekuatan-kekuatan oligarkis dengan sendirinya akan terkikis. Setidaknya secara teoritis seperti itu gitu. Tapi dalam prakteknya yang kita lihat selama ini atau akhir-akhir ini justru sebaliknya. Bagaimana hal ini kok bisa terjadi? Yang satu justru bisa duduk berdampingan dengan sangat mesra, katakanlah begitu, dalam konteks mempertahankan jalannya kekuasaan. Dan kita mengamati munculnya suatu bentuk baru yang membuat katakanlah kong kaling kong oligarkis dan demokratis, kekuatan-kekuatan ini dibumbui dengan munculnya suatu pola populisme incumbent, di mana kekuatan yang berkuasa menggunakan sumber-sumber resmi demokrasi untuk melanggengkan atau mempertahankan kekuasaan. Nah, tentu pertanyaannya bagi kita sebagai bagian dari bangsa adalah dengan segala implikasinya mau sampai kapan? Atau pertanyaan yang lebih praktis adalah adakah harapan atau titik terang ke depan? Nah, oleh karena itu forum ini kita selenggarakan untuk melihat secara lebih jernih fenomena yang terjadi sehingga kita masing-masing dapat mengambil sikap yang lebih tepat. Saya mengucapkan terima kasih mewakili IPP kepada Pak Fedi yang telah berkenan dan juga Pak Robinson dan terutama Prof. Eri Seda juga yang masih dalam perjalanan. Dan juga terima kasih kepada banyak pihak khususnya ARC dari UI, Departemen Sosiologi, ada Bu Indira dan juga ada Tika dan Inanya yang selama ini menjembatani, termasuk dari kita ada Mbak Andina. Terima kasih juga kepada semua pihak termasuk wartawan yang hadir hari ini. Secara khusus terima kasih kepada tim kecil IPP yang telah bekerja keras untuk menyiapkan acara ini sehingga kita bisa berkumpul hari ini. Sekali lagi terima kasih dan selamat berdiskusi serta mengutip slogan Forum Semanggi yang kita selenggarakan secara rutin. Selamat membuka ruang imajinasi. Terima kasih, selamat siang.
Terima kasih Bapak Salvatore atas sambutan pembukanya. Berikutnya, sambutan akan disampaikan oleh Ketua Departemen Sosiologi Universitas Indonesia. Kepada Profesor Dr. Indra Rata Irawati Patinasarani, saya persilakan.
Terima kasih kepada MC. Selamat siang Bapak Ibu sekalian. Yang terhormat Profesor Richard Robinson, Profesor Fedi Hadis dari University of Melbourne, yang saat ini Prof. Fedi menjadi adjunct profesor di Departemen Sosiologi FISIP UI. Kemudian kepada Prof. Eri Seda tapi belum hadir, dan tentunya kepada Bapak Salvatore sebagai Ketua IPP. Pada siang hari ini saya atas nama kolega dari Universitas Indonesia, khususnya Departemen Sosiologi, Lab Sosio FISIP UI, kemudian ARC, Asia Research Center, Di sini ada Mbak Inaya, juga Mbak Tika, mengucapkan terima kasih atas kesediaan Bapak Ibu untuk hadir dalam forum yang penting ini. Tentunya saya mengucapkan terima kasih untuk panitia yang mengatur semua kegiatan sehingga acara ini bisa terlaksana dengan baik. Saya rasa ini kerjasama Atmajaya dengan khususnya Departemen Sosiologi yang pertama ya. Jadi ini mudah-mudahan ini bisa menjadi langkah awal untuk kerjasama-kerjasama yang lebih produktif di masa ke depan nanti. Dalam forum hari ini saya rasa sangat penting ya, kita akan membahas buku yang saya rasa bisa menjadi acuan para, bukan hanya para akademisi ya, tapi khalayak ramai yang menjadi melihat bagaimana kondisi Indonesia saat ini dan bagaimana hidup yang ke depannya, tergantung pada perubahan-perubahan sosial, ekonomi, politik ke depan. Kami berharap kalau ada perubahan-perubahan lagi, semoga Prof. Fedi dan Prof. Robinson bersedia menulis kembali revisi dari edisi yang sekarang ini, dan kita bisa mendiskusikannya kembali. Ya, saya rasa demikian sambutan yang perlu saya sampaikan. Kami berterima kasih sekali dan selamat berdiskusi, dan sekali lagi terima kasih.
Terima kasih Prof. atas sambutan pembukanya. Untuk membantu jalannya acara pada hari ini, tentunya saya akan dibantu oleh moderator, yaitu Ibu Stefani Haning Suarati Nugroho. Izinkan saya untuk membacakan singkat profil dari moderator kita hari ini. Ibu Stefani Haning Suarati Nugroho PhD adalah dosen di Fakultas Psikologi Universitas Katolik Indonesia Atmajaya dan penulis buku The Divergent Nation of Indonesia Heterogeneous Imagining in Jakarta, Kupang, and Banda Aceh atau Springer di tahun 2020. Beliau meraih gelar doktor dari National University of Singapore dengan disertasi pemenang penghargaan tentang imajinasi kebangsaan di kalangan pemuda Indonesia. Beliau pernah menjadi Fulbright Scholar in Residence di Santa Do College, Florida, dan postdoctoral fellow di University of Brunei Darussalam. Penelitiannya terkait dengan kekuasaan dan identitas di Indonesia, termasuk kebebasan akademik, politik elektoral, dan juga pembungkaman suara minoritas saat ini. Saat ini, beliau tengah meneliti tentang academic self-censorship di Indonesia dan everyday militarism di kalangan anak muda. Demikian profil singkat dari Ibu Stefani Haning Suarati Nugroho. Selanjutnya saya persilakan kepada moderator untuk mengambil alih jalannya acara ini.
Oke, terima kasih MC untuk perkenalannya. Pertama-tama selamat datang di forum Semanggi nomor 4 ya. Hari ini saya akan berperan sebagai moderator. Ya. Dan sebenarnya memoderatori acara yang judulnya adalah Oligarchy and the End of Reformasi in Indonesia tuh agak menyakitkan buat saya, karena sebagai angkatan 97 dulu nih saya ingat hampir 28 tahun to the day ya. Kami menginap di sini, ini dulu belum galeri tapi ruang-ruang senat mahasiswa. Jadi kita siangnya waktu itu demo, terus lari ke kampus, kejebak, nggak bisa pulang, jalanan tertutup dan sebagainya. Ya sudah, kita di sini selama 2 hari. Saya ingat di pagi hari saya keluar, terus ada tank tentara dengan moncong menghadap ke arah sini. Apakah kita takut? Takut. Ada apa di luar? Kan kita nggak ada sosmed ya waktu itu, nggak ada HP. Takut sih. Tapi above all kita tuh optimis. Kami merasa dulu bahwa Soeharto itu sudah on the brink of collapse. Udah di ujung tanduk, dikit lagi, kita bertahan sedikit lagi. Gitu, dan kita berpikir bahwa setelah itu dunia akan lebih baik. Ya, maklum ya 19 tahun kan ya. Dunia akan lebih baik, kita akan lebih punya kebebasan. Jadi misalnya contohnya yang dalam pikiran anak 19 tahun waktu itu adalah setahun sebelumnya saya ikut pemilu untuk pertama kalinya, mencoblos. Jadi di akhir SMA. Terus saya ingat banget tuh ada guru masuk ke kelas dan bilang, kalian ini sudah di akhir masa SMA ya, sebentar lagi lulus. Jangan aneh-aneh Jadi nyoblosnya yang aman-aman saja. Oke, dan apapun mungkin niatnya baik ya, tapi saya merasa terintimidasi. Meskipun saya nurut juga akhirnya. Jadi waktu itu saya pikir, oke, kalau begitu kalau setelah Orde Baru berakhir, maka salah satu hal baru yang ingin saya rasakan adalah bisa memilih siapapun yang kita inginkan. Nah, fast forward ke 28 tahun kemudian, orang-orang memilih yang mereka inginkan, and here we are right now. Seperti ini keadaannya. Right? Jadi saya merasa, oke, yang kita harapkan waktu itu memang ternyata tidak seperti yang dibayangkan. Nah, karena itu buku ini menurut saya sangat-sangat timely ya, karena kita tiap hari melihat hal-hal yang mengindikasikan bahwa reformasi itu sudah tidak lagi seperti sesuai yang diharapkan. Nah, untuk membahas lebih lanjut lagi, saya hari ini akan ditemani oleh 3 pakar ya, 2 diantaranya yang memang benar-benar menulis buku ini. Jadi saya akan memperkenalkan para pembicara satu demi satu dan juga mempersilahkan untuk maju ke depan. Oke. Pembicara, Oke. Untuk mungkin bisa slide-nya digeser. Yang pertama pembicara kita adalah Profesor Fedi Hadis. Ya. Profesor Fedi Hadis ini adalah Profesor Asian Studies di Asia Institute and Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor dari University of Melbourne. Oke. Beliau ini yang menulis Oligarchy and the End of Reformasi di Indonesia, Power Reorganized. Prof Hadis meraih gelar doktor dari Murdoch University dan sarjana dari FISIP UI. Ya. Karya-karyanya antara lain adalah Reorganizing Power in Indonesia, The Politics of Oligarchy in an Age of Marketing, juga bersama Profesor Richard Robinson, dan Islamic Populism in Indonesia and the Middle East. Ya. Jadi ini dua buku ini atau setidaknya yang The Politics of Oligarchy itu memang seingat saya buku yang juga sangat penting ya untuk dan itu sebenarnya sudah di tahun 2004 ya, sudah ada alarm sounded tentang apa yang kita jalani sekarang. Prof Hadis silahkan. Silahkan. Okay. Pembicara kita kedua adalah Profesor Richard Robinson. Beliau adalah Honorary Professorial Fellow di Asia Institute, University of Melbourne, dan Emeritus Professor di Asia Research Center Murdoch University. Dan juga bersama dengan Prof Hadis merupakan pengarang buku Oligarchy and the End of Reformasi. Prof Robinson meraih gelar doktor dari University of Sydney dan dikenal sebagai salah satu pelopor kajian ekonomi politik Indonesia. Ya, jadi bukunya, buku klasiknya Indonesia, The Rise of Capital itu sangat-sangat penting ya, buat saya secara pribadi sangat eye-opening sebenarnya. Bersama Prof Hadis, Prof Robinson menulis Reorganizing Power in Indonesia, The Politics of Oligarchy in an Age of Market. Dan ini tetap menjadi karya rujukan kita. Prof Richard Robinson, please. Pembicara kita yang ketiga masih dalam perjalanan ya. Ini beliau adalah oh ya, silakan. Sorry. Yeay. Pembicara kita yang ketiga adalah Profesor sorry saya tuh sudah plus banget Profesor Francisca Saveria Sika Eriseda ya. Ya, mungkin kita kalau di Atmajaya lebih familiar dengan Bu Eri ini ya, lebih sering ketemu ya. Beliau adalah guru besar studi pembangunan pada Departemen Sosiologi FISIP Universitas Indonesia. Profesor Eriseda meraih gelar sarjana sosiologi dari UI, master dalam Asian Studies dari Cornell University, dan doktor dalam Development Studies dari University of Wisconsin-Madison. Nah, sekarang penelitian Bu Eriseda ini terfokus pada isu-isu terkait dengan kesejahteraan sosial ya Bu ya. konsumsi, isu-isu terkait eksklusi sosial dan pembangunan di Indonesia. Antara lain adalah riset kolaborasi internasional lintas 7 negara Asia. Prof. Ariseda ini juga pernah menjabat sebagai Ketua Departemen Sosiologi FISIP UI dan Ketua Dewan Redaksi Masyarakat Jurnal Sosiologi. Silahkan Prof. Seda. Oke, saya tidak akan mengambil waktu lebih banyak lagi. Kita akan memulai dengan pemaparan dari Prof. Fedi Hadis tentang publikasi terbarunya.
Begini, dengan sedikit membuat kekacauan dalam acara ini, kami bertiga setuju bahwa Eri akan membahas buku ini dulu, baru saya dan Dick akan menanggapi pembahasannya, gitu, supaya ininya lebih interaktif gitu. Lalu setelah kami bertiga itu berbicara, mungkin bisa diserahkan kepada audience supaya bisa lebih interaktif lagi gitu. Is that okay? Yeah, okay, alright. Dan kemudian saya ditugaskan oleh Andina, mana Andina, to speak in English and Indonesian, but to make sure not to speak any French or Javanese. Okay, so I will be switching from 2 languages. So that partly because we want to have a deep discussion about the substantive issues that we brought up in the book in such a way that Dick can fully, provide you with the answers and the sort of observations that he has in ways that, the first time he went to Indonesia was in 1974, and he only went to the discos, so he didn't learn much Indonesian then. And anyway, he's forgotten a lot of his Indonesian, so we've got to, switch between the 2 languages. Is that, yeah, okay, is that all right? Yeah, okay. Let me know if you actually learn more Indonesian in the discos than you told me about. Anyway, untuk pertamanya dulu, jadi sebelum Mbak Eri membahas, saya memberi konteks saja sebentar tentang kenapa buku ini terbit. Okay? Jadi in 2004, Dick and I wrote a book called Reorganizing Power, The Politics of Oligarchy in an Age of Markets. Okay? Konsep dasar dari buku itu adalah oligarki. Saat ini kemana-mana saya pergi, apakah itu ke redaksi Kompas atau ke warung kopi, saya dengar kata oligarki. Ya, tapi penggunaannya sangat simpang siur. And the usage of the term is not as intended by Dick and I, and therefore one of the things that we want to do here actually is to clarify what we mean by oligarchy, because it is the key concept to discuss the New Order, the Reformasi period, and what we now call the end of Reformasi. Yeah? And this book, called The End of Reformasi, is actually a revised, expanded, new edition of the 2004 book. Yeah, so we have added chapters, and we've rewritten the introduction and added a new preface. So it actually is an attempt to bring the analysis of 2004 to up to date, and to analyze what we now call, the period of the end of Reformasi. Jadi kira-kira gitu konteksnya. If I may just have maybe one or 2 minutes, the reason that it is important to I think, understand this concept of oligarchy is because politically, I have seen many people say, oh, those are the oligarchies that we have to get rid of. And they're always talking about big Chinese business. That's all they're actually referring to. Whereas Dick and I were not talking only a bit about big Chinese business. We were talking about a structural relationship of power, a social order characterized by the fusion of political, bureaucratic, and big business interests. Itu jadi penting untuk dipahami. Kita tidak ngomong tentang cuma konglomerat Cina gitu. Jadi kalau kayak gitu, ya politisi segala macam itu ya nggak ada dosanya gitu. Nah, menurut kita semuanya ada dosanya, gitu. Termasuk di dalam yang kita bahas. Gitu. Nah, untuk singkatnya kita mengatakan bahwa oligarki itu bersumber pada masa Orde Baru di tatanan yang sifatnya otoritarian dan tersentralisir. Reformasi menjatuhkan institusi-institusi Orde Baru, tetapi tidak oligarki yang menopangnya. Oligarki itu tetap bertahan dan beradaptasi pasca reformasi, pasca Orde Baru, Jadi dia itu antara 98 sampai menjelang sekarang ini berhasil menggunakan institusi-institusi demokrasi, mendominasinya, menguasainya untuk memajukan kepentingannya. Cuma cirinya berbeda, yaitu oligarki itu is more decentralized and more fragmented. There is no Suharto on top of them. And there are oligarchic factions, and they are shifting and they are fluid. The composition can change all the time, depending on what it is that they want to steal, basically, and all the way down to the local level. Tapi modal kayak gitu sangat tidak tertib. It's very, very messy. It creates problems in capital accumulation. It creates polarization in society during elections and so forth, and therefore there's a cost to it. The thesis of this new book is that we are now, the reason we're calling it the end of Reformasi is we're saying that the oligarchy is being re-centralized. So economic and political power is now being re-centralized. Even though you might still have the institutions of democracy, power is being decentralized through the Danantara, through the PSN, through the Kopdes, through all of these instruments that we talk about now. Okay, so from that point of view, right, we are seeing the end of Reformasi as characterized by a decentralized oligarchy, which is now becoming re-centralized, and with that, remilitarized, and with the impact of the limited wins that civil society got in terms of rights and so on being turned back. Okay, so that's what the book is about generally. Okay, think that's enough as a context, I think. Maybe a bit too much.
Well, thanks very much. It's really good to be back here and to see so many people I know and to see such a big audience to talk about this. I originally thought this would be a big discussion, and I hope that we can have a big discussion about things. But let me say that following on from Fedi, I've been talking to people, and a lot of people have been saying one of the things they're concerned about, and that in the title of the book is The End of Reformasi. And they say, really? Is this the end of Reformasi? Have we seen all of those gains that were made in the years after the crisis and the end of, are they gone? And why did it happen? Why wasn't Reformasi successful? And is there any hope that it will come back again? Well, one of the things I think is that we have to explain what we meant by Reformasi. In one way, we could say that Reformasi was, a revolution, but a revolution in the sense that there was institutional change to the constitution, change to the political parties. There was changes to the laws. The military lost their special status in representation. Decentralisation occurred. So that was an institutional reformation. But was it a political revolution or reformation? And was it a social one? And I think one of the things we have to consider is that it probably wasn't. So when we talk about the end of Reformasi, maybe Reformasi only happened at an institutional level, but not at other levels. So the end of Reformasi, we might be talking about the winding back of those institutional changes that occurred before. And this leads to the question of why did the oligarchy succeed? Well, maybe the answer is the oligarchy never went away. The institutions changed, it was fragmented, it went under the surface, but the oligarchy is a system of alliances and relationships and ideas was never dismantled. On the other hand, the forces that drove Reformasi never extended their power and influence beyond those institutional changes in the early stages. So those two questions are important. I mean, things aren't as bad as some people think. The end of Reformasi, big changes did happen, and that, for example, the press was able to operate much more freely, discussion in universities and the fluidity of ideas, and to some extent that hasn't gone away entirely. The new oligarchy has to live with some of those gains and changes from that previous period. The question is that some people ask is, well, is that we just have to live with those gains and see them gradually eroded over time, or is there something to do? Well, I think that's probably something that everyone can discuss, but I think that looking at Reformasi as a complex problem, and Reformasi has been something that has existed in Indonesia, the agenda and trends of Reformasi right from the beginning, through the 50s and 60s, we can all identify individuals and agendas that pushed Reformasi. And one of the problems, of course, is that it never became organised, first, and second, it never able to build alliances, broader social alliances. And that's what characterised, in those cases, in other countries where Reformasi has been successful, it has involved alliances between different groups. It's not only the middle classes or the professional classes or that, but it involves large other sections of the society. So I'll leave it there because I think, you know, we're hoping that people can come in with the things that really interest them, or that they want more explanation about, and let's hope that we can have a big discussion. Thanks.
Selamat siang Bapak Ibu, teman-teman semua. Saya meneruskan saja apa yang tadi sudah disampaikan oleh, saya panggil Mas Fedi aja ya, sama Pak Dik, tentang oligarki ini. Saya ingin meneruskan dengan membandingkan buku pertama tahun 2004 dengan buku yang baru saja direvisi dan diterbitkan tahun 2025-2026. Maaf saya meneruskan pakai bahasa Inggris saja gitu, nanti kita bisa diskusinya digabung. So what are the similarities and differences between the two versions of the book Reorganizing Power in Indonesia and Oligarchy and the End of Reformasi in Indonesia, Power Reorganized. Those are the full titles of these two different books. The revised book is not a rejection of the original work. Rather, it is an extension of the same theoretical project. The central argument that oligarchic power survived the fall of Suharto and adapted to new political conditions remains intact. What changes is the historical periods examined and the conclusions drawn from 2 additional decades of Indonesian politics. Major similarities. Both books place the concept of oligarchy at the center of analysis. In both editions, Mas Fedi and Pak Dik argue that Indonesian politics is best understood through the formation, persistence, and adaptation of oligarchic power rather than through democratization theory alone. Political and economic elites remain the key actors shaping institutions and policy outcomes. There are common assumptions in those two books. First assumption, wealth generates political influence. Second assumption, political influence protects wealth. Third assumption, state institutions become arenas of elite competition. This fundamental logical framework remains unchanged between these two books. Similarities, the second similarity is both books reject liberal transition theory. The idea, it's challenged by these two books, the idea that markets automatically create political competition. They challenge the idea that democracy automatically disperses power. And also the third challenge, the idea that institutional reforms automatically strengthen accountability. Both Mas Fedi and Pak Dik consistently argue that institutions are shaped by underlying power relations. Both books emphasize elite adaptation. A central theme in both books is that elites do not simply disappear during periods of political change. Instead, elites reorganize their power under new conditions, under authoritarianism, under democratization, under market reforms, and under state capitalism. This idea of power reorganization remains the theoretical core of both of these two books. Similarity, fourth similarity, both focus on political economy. Neither book views politics as separate from economics. Both books analyze business-state relations, patronage, political parties, economic policy, class power, and resource control. Both authors continue to treat politics and economics as deeply interconnected. But there are also major differences. Please correct me if I'm wrong here, Mas Fedi and Pak D. The first difference is the historical scope. The 2004 original edition primarily examines the new order, 1965 to 1998. Second, the Asian financial crisis. Third, the fall of Suharto. And the first years of Reformasi, 1998 to 2004. The main question of the original book is, why did oligarchic power survive the collapse of the new order? The 2025-26 revised edition extends this analysis through the Yudhoyono years, SBY, the Jokowi presidency, and the emergence of Prabowo's political order. The revised book central question becomes, what happened after oligarchic power successfully adapted to democracy? Main conclusion. The 2004 book conclusion was relatively cautious. Oligarchy survived Reformasi and reorganized itself within democratic institutions. 20 years later, 2025-26, the conclusion is even stronger. Oligarchy not only survived, but consolidated its dominance, leading toward what the authors call the end of Reformasi. The third difference, view of democracy. 2004, democracy was still a relatively new and open arena. The question in that book was whether democratic institutions could eventually constrain oligarchic power. 20 years later, the revised edition, I'm sorry to say, Mas Fedi dan Pak D, the authors are much more skeptical, unfortunately. After 2 decades of electoral politics, both authors argue that democracy, populism, and oligarchy have become compatible and mutually reinforcing. The fourth difference, economic focus. The original book, 2004, focuses heavily on neoliberal reform, market liberalization, privatization, and IMF-led restructuring. The key issue was how oligarchs adapted to an era of markets. 2 decades later, the revised version introduces several new concerns. First, economic nationalism. Second, state capitalism. Third, industrial policy. Last, stronger state intervention. The authors argue in the revised book that oligarchy can flourish not only under neoliberalism, but also under state-led development. Now, this is the most interesting part, treatment of Jokowi. In 2004, the original version of the book, Jokowi was not yet a national political figure. The analysis ends before his emergence. In 2025-26 revised edition, Jokowi becomes a major case study. The revised book argues that Jokowi's presidency illustrates how an initially outsider figure became incorporated into broader oligarchic coalitions and state-centered development strategies. And this is becoming more interesting, the revised version, treatment of Prabowo. In 2004, Prabowo appears only as a new order actor within discussions of elite politics. In the revised version, 2 decades later, Prabowo's presidency is interpreted as the culmination of long-term processes of oligarchic consolidation that began after 1998. New theoretical contribution. In 2004 edition, the main concept is oligarchy reconstituted. The focus is on survival and adaptation. In 2025-26 edition, there is a new concept, power reorganized beyond reformasi. It adds an entirely new section towards the end of reformasi, economic nationalism and state capitalism, oligarchy beyond reformasi. The focus shifts, as both the authors have mentioned earlier, from survival to consolidation and transformation. So, in conclusion, the 2004 book explains how Indonesia's oligarchs survived the fall of Suharto, whereas 2005 to 2026 revised edition argues that those same oligarchic forces have since consolidated their power within democratic institutions, state capitalism, and economic nationalism, producing what the authors describe as a post-reformasi political order. Now, this is just a question, I think, for all of us. In a very simple terms, with the end of reformasi, if we agree on that condition, what comes next? That is a question that I think we need to discuss. So if we agree, we can always debate and discuss whether it is actually the end of reformasi. But if we agree on that, as both of you seems to say in this latest revised book, so what next? What would happen to Indonesia political and economic system? Would it become more oligarchic? Or there is a little light at the end of the tunnel that civil society can actually do something about it? Can we put our hope on civil society? Because it seems if we agree on what you wrote on the last revised book, this is it. We cannot hope any longer for the state and for the economic system to do anything because they're already contaminated. I'm sorry, my language is a little bit strong. Contaminated by the oligarchic underlying power relations. So what next? Is there any hope for non-state actors, non-corporation actors, mainly civil society? And the next question would be, if we hope for civil society to play a role, what kind of civil society are we discussing here? Because by definition, we both know, all of us know that civil society are not all democratic. It can also be authoritarian in nature. So those are the several questions that I think is relevant for all of us to discuss. Thank you so much.
Please, you can go ahead and respond to that.
First of all, let me say, I think that we're going to distribute the antidepressants now. Who's in charge of the antidepressants? Okay, but thank you, Eri. That was a fantastic, sort of encapsulation of both books and comparisons of their emphases and actually the evolution of our concerns. That was really first rate. Thank you very much for that. And your questions are also first rate questions, but also questions I think that are on the minds of most people who have either an interest in Indonesia or people who actually live in Indonesia, whether or not they're part of a social movement or not, just regular people, right? So let me try to tackle the first provocative question, right? What happens after the end of Reformasi? I mean, as a joke, I can say there'll be a sequel, but I think Dick and I will be too old to write it, so somebody else will have to do it. But it's this, really. We think that, as you say, that the Prabowo presidency really is the culmination of a process that started 26 years ago. You mentioned Jokowi, right? And my friend Tatan is here. He will either buy me something to drink later, or he will, I don't know, stab me in the back when I'm not looking a bit later. But okay, my view, our view is this, okay, and Tatan can protest, that Jokowi, although a lot of people, voted for Jokowi to stave off Prabowo, in actuality, Jokowi has paved the way for Prabowo. Okay, so this re-centralization of oligarchy that we're talking about, that signifies the end of Reformasi, started with Jokowi. Right? And Rinov is here as well. He's probably the mastermind of this. And so the idea for me you know, my sense is that, look, Jokowi was outside, he came in, he had no political party. He had all these people, you know, sort of all claiming to have supported him, Yusuf Kala, Prabowo himself, and all these other people. What did he have? What did he need to do? Right? He had no political party, he had no, you know, instruments at the down level. He had the volunteer groups, which was important, right? But the thing he had to do was consolidate control over the bureaucracy. Right? So he had to centralize power and authority in the bureaucracy. Right? And that meant, right, sort of trying to just marginalize all of the other sources of authority there were. Parliaments, local governments, etc. Okay? Because that's the only way to get things done. Okay, so that there was that need in terms of the way that he was positioned to do that, right? But the consequence of that was that he needed to undertake projects, and because I'm working on a study of the PSN, Strategic National Projects, I'll just use that as an example. In 2017, he signed a presidential decision that said, what's it? Oh, okay, I thought that was a present for me. All right, so a presidential decision basically on the PSN, right? And as you know, the PSN means that any project, whether it's about real estate or about infrastructure or about industry, gets prioritized. It gets funded, and nobody can do anything about it. None of the departments, none of the ministries, none of the local governments, none of the environmental protocols and so on apply. Okay? What does this create? Well, this creates a situation where rent seeking becomes centralized again. Right? And here you already saw that bupatis, you know, dan wali kota segala mulai kesel karena sumber nafkahnya hilang. Ya kan? Nah, ini proyek Jokowi yang dia harus lakukan karena dia tidak punya kendaraan-kendaraan yang untuk bersaing antar oligarki itu berbentuk partai. Dia nggak bisa berantem di DPR itu, jadi dia ambil aja itu birokrasinya. Gitu. Kecuali dia mau tergantung 100% sama Mega kan. Oke. Nah, akibatnya ada apa namanya? Resentralisasi proses rent seeking di Indonesia yang tadinya terdesentralisasi sifatnya. Ya. Ya. Nah, lalu apa? Dia tahu dia nggak punya partai lagi pula. Dia ingat dia nggak punya partai, jadi dia harus melindungi diri. Apalagi dia diserang lewat apa namanya social media yang Islam itu dia Cina apa segala macam gitu kan. Jadi tentara dia deketin lagi. So he has to approach the military, right? He has to approach the military to start supporting his project, right? So that demilitarization from 1998 already has a setback. Okay. So all of these then, you know, Prabowo inherits. And he goes, I like all these, let's accelerate this stuff. Right? So what he does is he creates Danantara. Danantara places all of the assets of the national companies in his hands. It is not responsible to anybody but to the president. It cannot even be properly audited. you know, I would say, really, and this is only half a caricature, that Antara is the president's ATM. Right? He can use money there to spend it on anything he wants. Okay? And then he brings in the military because in this effort to re-centralize power, right, there will be those who feel that they're going to lose out, right? Because they're used to all the fighting and so on, right? It's a system they're used to, especially at the local level. Bring in the military. Who's going to fight the military? And he is the only one that has that authority over the military, right? Now, so what happens really is this. What we're seeing, besides the re-centralization of oligarchy, it can be framed as this, right? An effort by a faction of the oligarchy, led by Prabowo and his allies, to impose its hegemony over the rest of the oligarchy. And this has never been done successfully before. That is the project, to impose the hegemony over the entire oligarchy. Okay? And that has, and then, so is everything dark and are there no, no light at the end of the tunnel? I know somebody switched on the light. Well, look, first of all, let me say that there are lots of people I've heard say that the economy is going to collapse next month. I don't believe that, to be honest. I think there's a propensity to exaggerate things and so on, right? Because it's also politically expedient to do that. But, you know, the next 6 to 18 months, I think, are really important in terms of the economy. Why do I say this? Because any social order, any social project, any social agenda has its internal contradictions. And one of the contradictions of this agenda is this. You need to spend a lot of money to build the patronage networks that will support your agenda of re-centralization of power, but it creates problems for the running of the economy. Right? So what do? You either then spend less money on developing those patronage networks and then, you know, spending it properly on the economy, but that means that all these people will go, what do I get out of this? So that's the kind of but that's a contradiction. And that is something that I think is important. There's intra-elite conflict that still continues. And that goes down to the local level. I was mentioning how the bupatis and the mayors and so on, you know, are pissed off, right? Now, the thing is, they need these guys for elections. Not just for the Pilkada, but for the presidential elections. These are the guys they have to mobilize to win elections. So they can't piss them off completely. There have to be ways to bring them into the project of re-centralization. There is a hypothesis I have, which is not in the book, that a lot of them are being brought in as sort of subcontractors or sub-subcontractors, informal contractors to the state companies' projects in, you know, under the PSN. So these local politicos no longer, you know, ride on the backs of the Bupati and the Wali Kota, but on the BUMN. That's a possibility, I think. I mean, it still needs to be, I think, looked at and proven. It's a hypothesis, okay? But that's another conflict with the local people. A third conflict is that the PSNs are being pushed through all of society in ways that cause social dislocation, environmental degradation, repression, and so on, which means that there will be a proliferation of social conflict between local communities and the state and capital and the security apparatus. We've seen this in many, many sites. I was just in Wadas last week. And then there's, Eco City and Rempang and all that, right? So we know this is happening. Now, the problem with civil society is that, right? And I've talked to some of these people recently, I've said, look, the problem is we are treating these problems as episodic, right? Whereas what we need to do is to look at them as systemic. They're systemic. They're all, sort of connected systemically. Now, the task then is to develop alliances, strategies, agendas that would bring together disparate people affected by these sorts of development projects, right, in a way that could, in a substantive way, challenge or create problems, at least for those oligarchic coalitions. And that is not something that's impossible. It currently is implausible, though, because civil society groups are simply too fragmented, too siloized, and have no common agenda, and they fight each other all the time. That's it. Yeah, thank you.
I'll be very brief because
I was very long.
Well, he's always very long.
That's right.
In case you're feeling depressed, let me cheer you up. You're not alone. Across the world, you're seeing similar sorts of problems. You're seeing in Britain the slow uncollapsing of parliamentary liberalism in the face of people like, in the, what is it called, the Reform Party? Or,
your mic is not being heard. Yeah. Have you switched it on? Yeah.
Here, is that right?
Yeah.
Is that on?
Maybe.
Okay, I can hear now. So you're not alone. One theory is this, one idea that's going around is this, that the rise of neoliberalism in the 70s transformed society. It fragmented people, it fractured society, it marketized everything, it created more division, inequality, separation, and when it became so dysfunctional, it left a vacuum. It had largely done away with the Reformasi movement, or the whole Reformasi agenda itself, and left the way open for people like, people who wanted to come in with a populist message or with a strong leadership message saying, we know you feel that you're alone, that it's out of control, that all sorts of bad people are running the world. What we need is a strong leader to take over. And so it opened the door for a centralised oligarchy, a centralised leader. And this feeling, and so everywhere around the world, you look in Europe, if in Poland, Hungary recently, a big victory for people who voted for a more democratic sort of oligarch. But he still was a central member of the oligarchy. So one of the ways to look at it is this. if there's not going to be a sort of a movement from civil society to overthrow oligarchy, one thing that seems to be happening, is fracturing within the oligarchy, which throws up all sorts of other political alliances and gives opportunities for some people to come in and put in a more reformist agenda. So, you look at the oligarchies that are fractured. Duterte's challenge in the Philippines, well, that didn't end well, did it? I mean, he was just another oligarch challenging central power. Thaksin in Thailand, well, his was not as cynical. He eventually became genuinely a more sort of distributive sort of person. So I think one of the things to look at for the future is what's going to happen to this oligarchy. And as Fedi said, there's contradictions within what they're doing. It's going to force them to reconsider their positions. It's going to create fractures, opportunities for broader social alliances. That's how societies work. So in Britain, the first liberal democracy that happened, you find that even today, elements of the old oligarchy have remained intact and embedded in it, but they weren't strong enough at that stage in the Industrial Revolution to prevent quite a serious social change occurring. So the thing is, start thinking about about the oligarchy itself and the fractures and contradictions in it. And the other thing I think is interesting, and I noticed this in Indonesia, is because you've got so much going on here, you tend to be looking at just at Indonesia, but look more at what's happening in Indonesia as perhaps in different ways part of a large global trend in the development of capitalist society itself. So I'm going to shut up now because Fedi took up 2/3 of my time. And
Did you get your antidepressants?
Okay, thank you. Before we start with the audience, I would like to ask one more question, and it's actually related to what Prof. Seda said. So what do we do now? Because based on what you are saying, it's like fractures in the oligarchy, but then also in the civil society itself. So we're looking at fractured society. Is there anything we can do to prevent that? Especially looking from the university's point of view, for instance.
Is that for me? Okay. Do you want to have a go at that one? Well, if you've got a fractured civil society and you think of yourselves as a civil society that wants progressive change, then the thing to do is to unfracture yourselves. Okay, and Dick was saying to me that they think about it a lot, don't they? But they don't do it. You were saying that to me the other day.
I haven't seen a manifesto.
So I often say this, that history is very stingy. Sejarah itu sangat pelit. It only gives you opportunities very, very rarely. Tahun 98 adalah kesempatan karena oligarkinya sempat linglung. Ya. Tetapi dari civil society nggak ada yang masuk ke dalam to fill the void. So the old oligarchs managed to reconstitute, reorganize, and said, all right, we'll go back in, even though it's a new space, a democratic space. Yang lain-lainnya itu tersingkir. Ya kan? Bahkan orang-orang yang quote-unquote progresif di dalam partai politik tersingkir semua dalam beberapa tahun, kecuali Titan. I can't resist, man. We haven't seen each other for years. You haven't heard my jokes for years. So, apa namanya? Sangat mungkin loh, sangat mungkin bahwa proyek ini berhasil karena dia punya kemampuan untuk menavigasi rimba ekonomi politik yang sangat kuat, didukung oleh 70% parlemen, didukung oleh pengusaha walaupun suka marah-marah karena dimintain duitnya terus, gitu, ya. Tetapi ada kemungkinan juga bahwa kalau krisis ekonominya itu dalam 6 bulan, 18 bulan itu menjadi lebih parah, ya, elit itu kemudian fracture, itu membuka pintu. Namun, ya, apabila civil society itu tidak mempunyai koherensi, tidak mempunyai agenda bersama, yang terjadi adalah kooptasi. Satu-satu dikooptasi. Jadi fractured lagi. Jadi the only way to deal with the oligarchy is from a position of relative strength, of relative organization and coherence. If you challenge them from a position of being fractured, disorganized, siloized, what happens is that some people get co-opted and the rest just get marginalized. Jadi itu yang harus dikerjakan supaya itu tidak terjadi, sehingga apabila sejarah memberikan kesempatan lagi, tidak mengulang 98. Ya, kemungkinannya nggak besar, terus terang aja. Tapi hanya itulah kemungkinannya. Or maybe Eri want to add anything else? No?
Sedikit saja, Mas Fedi. Kalau listening to what you're just saying, the question would be for the next, future is, how do we solidify civil society across, make a systemic counter, not only narrative, but counter movement against this oligarchy, and how to actually make the oligarchy in place fractured.
Yeah.
That's basically what you're saying, right? So the civil society has to solidify systematically. I'm really interested when you mention all these different case studies of Wadas, of Rempang and all this. How do you solidify systematically all these case studies of local movement into a national social movement while at the same time trying to fractionalize the oligarchic elites? Especially if we can learn something from history, the Indonesian military. If and when there's a fraction in the military, usually there's a change, though unfortunately usually with violence. Learning from history, that's what happened. So that is what is, my understanding what both of you were saying, right? But I think we should, discuss further. Thank you.
Thank you. Terima kasih. Sekarang silahkan kepada audiens jika ada yang mau bertanya atau ada ide how to solidify. Kita ada merch ya untuk penanya. Silahkan. Let's start from there. Silahkan.
Ada mastermind-nya Jokowi itu.
Let's take 3 questions first ya. 3 pertanyaan dulu. Okay. Just say your name and where you're from. Dari mana mungkin?
Saya duluan.
Boleh pakai bahasa Indonesia dan saya terjemahkan.
Bahasa Indonesia ya?
Yes.
Selamat siang, nama saya Tika. Saya dari Universitas Indonesia. Saya mau menyambung pertanyaan soal dari Mbak Eri tadi ya, mensolidifikasi civil society, dan dari Pak Dik dan Pak Fedi soal civil society yang disuruh berdiri maaf, yang sibuk dengan fragmentasi, tapi sibuk membahas fragmentasinya tapi nggak bisa, kesulitan membangun dirinya sendiri gitu ya kira-kira. Pertanyaan saya, dalam riset-riset gerakan sosial gitu ya, yang sering terjadi adalah gerakan sosial menjadi elitis dan kehilangan akuntabilitas kepada basis yang di mana harusnya yang diklaim direpresentasikan. Pertanyaan saya, adakah contoh? Dick says that we need to imagine the world outside us, like to see Indonesia in a comparative perspective. Jadi pertanyaan saya, apakah ada sebuah contoh sejarah di mana basis terkonsolidasi dan elit gerakan tetap akuntabel kepada basis sehingga menjadi kekuatan sosial yang terkonsolidasi? Do I need to translate that to Dick? Yeah.
Are there
Thank
any
you.
examples from world history where sort of social movements were able to actually displace the elites and create a new, different social order?
I think that one of the things, maybe the problem is that the word civil society, imagining the world as civil society versus the state, or civil society versus the market or something, maybe you have to get rid of the idea of civil society and start thinking in terms of politics. That is, instead of a civil society movement, you know, where you can have demonstrations or that, maybe the thing to focus on is a political party or a political movement, or which doesn't include all of civil society, doesn't imagine itself a civil society, but has specific agendas. One interesting thing, I don't know if this is switched on.
Yeah, it is.
It is how the Republicans, right wing in America, managed to build themselves up after a long period of democratic rule. And the first reason was the Democrats were they were distant, they were inefficient. And the other thing is that where there are complex problems, it's difficult to explain these to people. You can't get out with a slogan for a complex problem. But what the Republicans did was they gradually infiltrated all the court systems with their own people. They built neighbourhood groups and that. They didn't imagine themselves as civil society. They imagined themselves as a political movement. And one of the things interesting in Indonesia is there's no political party really that has a coherent ideological or agenda. What is the difference between them? It's the personality, or it's different networks of patronage, or different. Maybe the idea of building a political party might be something. Get away from social movements and that. And of course, some of them will be part of a political movement, some won't. You know, of course, as I think I said last time I was here, motorbike gangs and the Ku Klux Klan, they're social movements, but we wouldn't want them in our political party, would we? just because they're social movements.
We don't like the uniforms. I think if we talk about broad, world history, obviously, yes, the bourgeois revolutions of Europe created new social orders. Whatever you think of the results, the socialist revolutions of the 20th century did create new social orders, whether you agree with what they created or not. So history does provide examples of elites dominating social orders that are completely displaced and a new social order emerging. They're very rare, and often the results are not so great. I mean, in the French Revolution, there was a reign of terror afterwards, right? So it does happen, but very rarely. And I think going to what Dick said, we have, for example, a Labour Party now in Indonesia, right? But in fact, we've had several Labour parties in Asia, right? Yeah, Chandra, yeah? I can pick on people and make jokes about all of them. Right? But the thing is, you see, like the British Labour Party or the Australian Labour Party was organically linked to their labour movements. And that gave them power and authority as a Labour Party. Our Labour parties often like to have chats with Prabowo more than they would actually like to, deal with the grassroots. Okay, so yes, but there, we do, I think, have to think about being involved in political contestation, but political parties or political vehicles more generally that are not organically linked to social movements are also prone to fragmentation and cooptation, and so we have to remember that too, I think. Now, again, Tika, I mean, these are smaller sort of examples, and they're not completely, sort of stories of success. I think I mentioned it recently to somebody. In the Philippines, the social movements there of the left created Akbayan. Akbayan has had some success. It hasn't been able to, dismantle the oligarchic politics of the Philippines, but it is a real political presence, right? I mentioned that in Korea, at least for a period, the Labour Party produced by the alternative labor movement of Korea got into parliament and did initiate labor reforms and so on, that even after they lost, remain. Right? So you do have these little examples, actually. Yeah. So history is not completely against us. It's just we have to find a way to actually find the formula that will get us over the line.
Sorry. Just one sentence. A famous person once said that revolution is the kicking in of a rotten door. So in other words, there has to be not only sort of organisation and thinking on one side, on the other side there has to be not only a crisis, but a decay. Decay.
Pembusukan.
Okay, I'm taking the second question from.
Well, I think every autocrat is strongly supported by the military. So I think local resistance can be easily not only co-opted by, but also crushed by the military. You know, the reversal has been prepared by using authoritarian legalisms and also by using violence as instrument. You know also that using authoritarian legalism, they have made amendment to the 10E, authoritarian legalisms. They have made amendments to the 10E law, and now while the civil society sent file to the constitutional court, they have made silently, they're implementing regulation, government regulation about this that support, legalize the so-called military operation other than war. And you know the substance of this, and our civil society now prepare response to the Committee 1 of the Parliament. But more importantly that, the regimes have made 700 the so-called development territorial battalion, and they will post 1 battalion in 1 municipality. And you know also, now we have already 1 regional command in every provinces. In every province in Indonesia, so we have totally 38 Kodam, regional command. And with the so-called component cadangan, the reserve component, actually they are civilians, yeah? We can say also militias. So how can the civil society, let's say, in response with this situation? So the authoritarian legalisms and the using of violence will be problems.
Do you want to give examples of where the military abandoned authoritarian regimes?
One interesting example was in the Russian Revolution, where whole military battalions just refused to fight for the Tsar and crossed. And the reason for that is the devastating defeats in the First World War. You know, war plays a big part in these sorts of things. War can devastate something in a way. Second, a lot of these soldiers were peasants and suffering, incredibly greatly. But that in itself, it was the defeat in the war, and I think it was the collapse and the decay inside the Tsarist regime. But the military, I think, quickly saw that there was no future for them in that regime, and so they moved aside. I'm just trying to think of
Iran under the Shah.
Under the Shah, the military
79, yeah.
decamped, yes. Can't think off the top of my head of any examples, but I'll wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with another example, and I'll text everyone.
But the key, I suppose, is that I think it is a mistake to think of the military as a monolithic entity. There are, always factions in the military, and they can go different ways under different contingencies. And secondly, the military always has a material interest. If its material interest is not being served by the status quo, it may abandon it. So what you've described there, has not got us, we've not got into the situation that, Dick and I have been describing. But what we're saying is that history has shown examples where militaries have actually fractured and abandoned authoritarian regimes. So it is not out of the question to think that there may develop, contingencies, conjunctures, where something similar might happen in the future in Indonesia, although I can't at the moment think of what kind of circumstances that would be.
Third question. You want to add something?
Okay, bismillah.
Andrinov, the father of PSN.
Oke, selamat siang. Pertanyaan saya itu simple, tapi mungkin sedikit memprovokasi ya. Tapi mudah-mudahan enggak. Karena buku judulnya aja udah sedikit memprovokatori. The End Reformasi Indonesia, Power Reorganisasi. Jadi kalau tidak apa-apa kalau saya juga mempertanyakan sesuatu yang mungkin sedikit memprovokasi. Kita tahu bahwa sejarah 98 itu diawali dengan krisis politik. Kemudian muncul krisis ekonomi. Dan itu juga terjadi sekarang di eranya Prabowo gitu. Pertanyaannya adalah, apakah tragedi 98 itu ada tidak kemungkinan bakalan terulang kembali di era sekarang? Bisa atau tidak? Karena sejarah itu ada kemiripan sejarah di zamannya Soeharto dengan di zamannya Prabowo. Entah karena persoalan dia menantunya atau bagaimana, saya juga kurang tahu. Tapi kalau dilihat dari situasi kondisi politik dan ekonomi sekarang, ini menandakan bahwa tragedi 98 ini bakalan terulang kembali. Dan situasinya ini Prabowo sendiri itu seolah-olah sedang seperti memasang bom waktu, dan itu terulang kembali. Entah apakah dia bakalan lari lagi kembali ke luar negeri atau tidak gitu. Saya kecurigaanku ya kita menunggu saja apakah revolusi 98 itu bakalan terulang atau tidak. Itu ya, terima kasih.
So the question is whether 1998 might happen again, because there's so many similarities with what's going on now. What do you think? 1998, the reform, yeah.
Look, I mean, I think that what I'm trying to say, and I think what Fadi is trying to say as well, is that when you're thinking of change, you have to think of it coming from inside as well as from outside. And you've also got to look at not only the people, but the circumstances that change around them, that make, for example, in Western countries, the housing crisis is creating a whole new set of politics. So in most cases, the past few years have been decades of growth, and most people, there's been more employment in that. If that turned around, it would change the dynamics of politics altogether. What happened, I suppose, in 1997, 98 was that a huge economic crisis, just decimated a lot of the top business groups. It plunged Indonesia into such huge debt, and then 6 months later, the whole regime collapses from inside. Suharto collapsed because people around him no longer saw him as the answer to the problem. Now, that all came together. You can't sit around waiting for that sort of thing to happen. It really happens. And, nobody can say, well, I think that sort of thing is going to happen again. Some people are predicting a huge global economic crisis in the next couple of years, driven by an AI boom and the increasing sort of inequalities of wealth and that. But I don't think we can rely on those sort of predictions. Nobody knows they're going to happen until they do, in many cases. So I don't think at the moment the conditions for what happened in 1997 and 98 are in place. But I do think that if we want to understand what's happening, we have to look sort of inside as well as outside the political power centres.
Can I? Yeah. If I may, I think that you should not hope for 1998 to repeat, because you've seen the result. Don't hope for 1998 to repeat, right? So you'd want a different outcome than in 1998, and the different outcome the outcome would only be different if the old falls and the new is ready to replace it. Right now, we have no new to replace it. So if Prabowo, let's say, falls, somebody else from the, some other, I was going to say a rude word, starting with A, ending with E, will replace him. Okay? So, and just to keep things in perspective, all right? Look, I think that we are experiencing a crisis that is getting more and more serious. The rupiah falling down means imports are expensive, and that, that it impacts on production and exports. It means, poor people, the consumption of people, including poor people, is affected, and there's lots of problems from that. But there are a lot of differences from 1998. First of all, we still have $140 billion of reserves. Yeah, we still have the FDI has not left Indonesia. What's left is portfolio investment. Okay, and there has not been a run on the banks like in 1998. So there are some similarities, and I think we should take the ongoing, crisis as it develops seriously. But the calamity that a lot of podcasters and so on are talking about, I think is partly to monetize their podcasts. Okay, thank you.
I just remind everyone of that famous Gramsci statement. The old order is dying, but the new one cannot yet be born. And in the intermediate period, what we have is morbid symptoms. Yeah, morbid symptoms will appear. So it's not only the an old order dying, the rotten door can be there, but if there is no new force emerging from all of this, you'll just see there'll just be a repeat. So
can you the next round of questions from that way? So you have raised blue shirt. I think
Ini sayap kiri belum dapat.
ya, kanan dulu ya. Kanan dulu semua kita ke kiri.
Terima kasih, saya dari Deda dari UGM. Saya mau tanya positioning buku ini melihat NGO bagaimana? Karena saya kebetulan di Jakarta sedang field research juga terkait dengan NGO, dan ada problem yang cukup kontras di rezim Jokowi sama rezim Prabowo. Kawan-kawan NGO yang kelas menengah terdidik ini di rezimnya Jokowi cenderung bisa mengakses dengan partai politik. Sedangkan di rezim Prabowo kecenderungannya cukup kesulitan untuk masuk ke dalam rezim masuk dalam politics. Ada di situ ada guardiannya, ada kayak Dasku dan lain-lain. Ini kawan-kawan NGO ini, terutama NGO bidang pemilu ya, ini kesulitan akses bagaimana, sehingga saya mau tanya posisi buku ini apakah sama melihat NGO di tahun 2004, terutama bukunya Bung Fedi terkait dengan localizing power, kan bisa bicara soal NGO cukup keras dan itu cukup ditentang kawan-kawan NGO juga. Apakah positioning masih sama pasca kita melihat pasca donor juga, dan positioningnya terkait dengan itu bagaimana? Thank you.
Ya, sebetulnya ada posisi dilematis ya, bahwa NGO adalah bentuk organisasi yang paling mungkin untuk bergerak di segala bidang ya, dan memang mempunyai sejarah dan pengalaman untuk melakukan itu. Tetapi juga ada istilah the NGOization of social movements, and that can be a problem. And kalau posisi saya adalah bahwa sejak Bank Dunia, since the World Bank said NGOs good, you know, and started supporting NGOs, it's become bad. Because really NGOs are supposed to behave, right, and just make sure that people work according to rationally optimize their outcomes by working through market mechanisms, and that's what NGOs are supposed to help people do, you know, with microcredits and this and that. There's a value in doing this sort of work, but there's also some real restrictions or constrictions, right? And I think that it has depoliticized a lot of NGOs. And that is, I think, a problem in terms of developing social movements that have to be political.
And just to add to that, remember democracy promotion, building democratic institutions, technocratic good governance. These were substitutes for politics. And democratic promotion really meant what some writers have called low-intensity democracy. In other words, they were democracies that enabled the market rules to be followed, but without the sort of rights and civil and individual rights and access to be included. They took the back seat for that. So we have to be careful of the technocratic solutions to problems.
Bapak silakan.
Terima kasih, saya Gilbert Simanjuntak. Kalau saya membungkus terminologi ini mungkin dalam satu kata ini, if I encapsulated these topics in one terms, maybe I will use political decay. Decay, pembusukan politik. Karena ada lingkaran setan yang tidak terputus, vicious circle of political movement between elite, dan saya melihat itu terjadi sebenarnya lebih di oligarki partai politik. If something happen again similar to Reformation 98, maybe in the next period, I just totally disappointed with the outcome of Reformation 98, what we have now. Jadi kalau saya menganjurkan, apakah mungkin kita putus oligarki ini di partai politik sehingga outcome-nya ke depannya menjadi lebih baik. Kenapa saya katakan? Karena banyak aktor-aktor bajingan ini sebenarnya pindah dari satu ke yang lain dan dia hidup. Selalu ada tempat buat dia beranak pinak. Kalau kita hanya punya 3 partai politik, masyarakat akan mudah sekali menghukum partai ini tidak menang. Tapi dengan banyaknya partai ini, masyarakat juga lupa. Kalau hanya 3 dia dikasih uang juga, saya kira dia juga udah kecewa, dia terima uangnya, dia nggak akan pilih. Kenapa saya tanyakan? Karena saya ingin sekali cari solusi. Saya lihat bukunya sangat menarik dari ekstensifikasi 2000 terbitan edisi pertama ke berikut. Tetapi saya mencoba melihat apa yang mungkin ditawarkan lebih dari buku ini untuk kemudian kita aplikasikan memutus pemain-pemain gila yang di oligarki ini. Begitu. Terima kasih.
Look, I think that the very act of saying there can only be three political parties is already an anti-democratic act, right? So, I mean, under what kind of rationale can you say that, well, Indonesians really can only be represented by 3 different political parties, given the variety of interests and so on that exists within Indonesian society. So when the New Order did that in 1971, it was an act of political engineering, right? Really, it was just one party and 2 ornamental things, right? So that's the danger, I think, of saying, you know, let's engineer that there should only be a small number of parties. I mean, the thing is that it is possible, like in Australia, you have many parties, but there are only 2 or 3 or 4 powerful parties, right? In America, you have many, many parties, but there are only 2 parties that really matter, right? Without it being, you know, politically engineered. Now, the other thing that worries me about that proposition is this. You're saying that it's the parties that, you know, that host the bastards. I'm saying that the bastards are everywhere, not just in political parties. And if you close down the political parties, they'll go somewhere else. Like in the New Order, when there were 3 political parties, where were the bastards? They were in HIPMI, they were in Kadin, they were in KNPI, they were in HKTI, they were in all sorts of organizations of bastards, right? So really, the problem is the system of political economic bastardry. That is what needs to be eradicated, and all the other things are really just symptomatic of that, you know, fundamental system of political economic bastardry. Maybe that's the title of our new book.
At the same time, you know, it's not an institutional problem, nor is it a behavioral problem. It is a way in which power relationships have been forged over history and vested interest vested in those. So if you're talking about reforming an existing system, there are thousands and millions of people who have vested their interests within it. It's a social order. And until, you know, social orders fall, when those people don't see their interests being served. But I mean, that can just mean the descent into chaos. And that's where political organisation comes in to the thing. So I think it's also worthwhile looking historically at how Indonesia ended up in this situation and how these relationships were forged over time. They all have a long history that stretched back into the colonial period. I mean, there was no powerful landowning class in Indonesia that had an important impact on things. Why was the bureaucracy and the military so powerful? Because at the end of colonialism, they were the last ones standing after the Dutch left. There wasn't anything else. So it's a deeper social and economic problem as well as a political problem. And of course, with the defeat of the PKI didn't only mean the defeat of communism, it meant the defeat for decades to come of social democratic parties with an agenda of class and that who were not communist as well. So, in other words, it's a long history that we should be looking for. And there are no quick, we can't send everyone to psychologists to get them to be nice people or build in new institutions that are going to make a difference in themselves.
Other wing. So, one more from this side? Yeah.
Okay. So, I want to ask, do you think that the Reformasi's failure, both in part of the resistance from the elites, as well as part from the civil society itself, to introduce an alternative political ideology against capitalism itself, is one of the reasons why we are in this position today? And do you think building this ideological alternative, especially in this age of cooptation and intimidation and suppression, can happen practically and quickly enough? Yeah, that's.
I'll always give you first. These are difficult. These are very difficult questions. I mean, I suppose one thing is that if you say, look, forget about civil society versus the government, that's not the thing. But there are issues, like issues of land stealing, issues of local corruption and all that that should be the object of action, but at the same time, not just actions in themselves, but tied up to a broader political set of ideas and organisations, so that you can start from the bottom and build politics on the top of it. One of the problems with a lot of civil society organisations is that they're focused on their immediate fear, but not on organising to do much about it in the long term. Or there are people who are ideologically driven who want to start movements but don't have any concrete, because they were really worried about these real problems. They were real problems. They only accelerated their repression, once the Americans started bombing and the Israelis came in and started handing out machine guns to people in the crowd. So that there are real concrete issues and deciding what they are. So if you've got an NGO worried about building a dam, they suppose we've got to find other people who've got similar worries, you know, across because this is a symptom of a larger structure, not just an event in itself.
Just to add to that answer, you mentioned ideology, right? Okay. One of the problems with Indonesian, I think, political and social history is that the realm of ideology has been increasingly narrowed, right? So if you go back to the 40s and 50s, there were all kinds of competing ideologies, right? Even the left had different kinds of left. The right had different kinds of right, right? That's it. Okay. And then from the 80s onwards, at least, everybody was Pancasila, right? And then, you know, insofar as there was at least some dissent, right? And sort of harking back to maybe some of the 70s dissent, you had Islamist, you know, sort of ideologies, sort of challenging the status quo. So that's all you got in Indonesia now. Nationalism and basically Islamism. And Islamism, of course, has got its different varieties, right? There is, look, I keep telling my colleagues in different places when they talk about liberal change in Indonesia, name a liberal party in Indonesia. There is no liberal party in Indonesia, much less a social democratic party, much less a socialist party, right? But in reality, the objective conditions actually are opening up the possibility for new ideological constructs and imaginations. Not just in Indonesia, really, but in America, in Europe, in Latin America, and so on. But we're talking about Indonesia. Yeah? But we're still confined to that religion, sometimes versus Islamism. But in reality, I am increasingly convinced that the state has simply mixed it up together for its convenience. So religious nationalism, whatever you want to call it, right? And that covers everybody, so everybody can come in the tent. Right? So if we continue to think within the imaginational kind of confined realms, you know, of nationalism and religion only, I think that it is difficult to think about broader alliances and coalitions and so on. It does require imagining, you know, sort of liberal, social democratic, socialist kinds of alternatives and possibilities. And they remain missing. I think the social base for them are actually developing more than they had in the 70s and 80s because there are more precariously positioned people. The middle class, which everybody said, wow, there's 55% middle class in Indonesia now. Nobody says that because, well, I used to count that of that 55%, 70% of them were only precariously middle class. Right. And now it's probably higher than that. I don't know what the statistics are, and it depends on how you count it. These all open up opportunities for new kinds of thinking, new kinds of imaginations. But nobody's got the imagination.
You can't go back to the past.
Well, you can't, but you can, I suppose, learn from it. Yeah, you can learn. Yeah. And Indonesia has a history of, you know, all kinds of ideological constructs, different manifestations of them, and different kinds of amalgamations of them. Since the early 20th century, let's say, till about 65, that one can actually learn from. You can't replicate because the historical context is different, but learning from that, I think, is something that is useful as a political act.
Thank you. I think time is almost up, but I still have you. I saw so many questions.
Bapak PSN nggak dapat?
Yeah. Okay. Maybe like 3 more questions.
Ada Bapak PSN.
This one.
Ada Bapak Gerakan Kiri.
Yeah. Okay. And then this. Maybe this one. So 3 more questions. That one. And then.
Terima kasih. Saya terima kasih khusus ke Prof. Edi dengan sebutan Bapak PSN, saya jadi kasih kesempatan ya. Nanti aja. Sebetulnya gini, saya ingin membelokkan kembali ke yang akademik ya, untuk nanti nyambung ke komentar soal peluang-peluang mengembalikan reformasi. Saya rasa konsep atau teori oligarki ini menurut saya sudah jadi konsep dan teori yang established. Ya. Saya belum baca buku, katanya masih pre-order statusnya ya. Saya belum baca, tapi kita tertolong oleh paparan yang disampaikan oleh Mbak Eri tadi. Kemudian juga kira-kira beberapa minggu yang lalu Jeffrey kirim cover bukunya yang baru ya. The blind spot, how oligarch dominate our democracy. Kan? Saya rasa ini 2 buku, satu revisi atau pengembangan, satu juga saya rasa juga pengembangan dari buku oligarkinya yang sebelumnya dari Jeffrey. Yang saya maksud dengan isu akademik begini, kalau kita sepakat konsep dan teori oligarki ini sudah established ya, dan sejauh pengamatan saya mungkin agak ini ya, Bung Fedi, cukup banyak yang sudah kenal seperti apa yang dimaksud tentang oligarki. Mungkin sebagian tentu masih salah paham bahwa menangkap konsep itu ya, disamakan dengan pengusaha kelompok tertentu gitu. Tapi yang dipahami, yang memahami seperti konsep apa yang disampaikan di bukunya Fedi, bukunya Jeffrey itu saya rasa sudah cukup banyak. Nah, saya tidak mengatakan ini sudah cukup dan membosankan, tidak. Tapi saya rasa kita harus turun ke middle range teori, ya, mencari peluang-peluang untuk mengisi di isu-isu level menengahnya. Ya, tadi beberapa saya rasa muncul. Nah, saya melihat salah satu yang kurang ditangkap oleh teman-teman di luar ya, karena ada beberapa papers terbaru juga tentang oligarki gitu. Salah satu fenomena yang kurang diamati adalah tumbuh dan berkembangnya politik barter politik ya. Kalau kita lihat sebetulnya apa yang ini awalnya memang berkembang di legislatif atau di Senayan ya. Apa yang menjadi produk-produk legislatif, kemudian juga produk yang lain dalam bentuk komisioner, itu kalau kita lihat dengan jeli itu adalah semua hasil barter politik. Ya, anggota komisioner ini adalah barter antara fraksi ini dan fraksi ini. Pasal-pasal tertentu, terutama di undang-undang yang berkaitan dengan sumber daya ekonomi, itu adalah hasil barter antar kekuatan-kekuatan. Dan memang Jokowi meneruskan itu, bahkan mengembangkan itu. Puncak barternya adalah, atau barter terbesar dalam politik Indonesia adalah Gibran. Ya, Gibran adalah hasil atau perkembangan yang puncak dari politik barter di Indonesia. Nah, kalau kita lihat lagi kenapa 3 bulan sebelumnya sudah dibentuk lembaga-lembaga di dalam istana atau kepresidenan, masih di masa pemerintahan Jokowi, dan itu adalah lembaga untuk pemerintahan Prabowo, ya, walaupun Prabowo masih 3 bulan lagi dilantik, itu adalah hasil dari barter, ya, itu menunjuk indikasi dari berkembangnya budaya barter. Nah, sumber ekonomi. Kenapa saya sampai menulis di Kompas tentang tata kelola batubara rasa kolonial? Ini juga satu hal yang kurang menjadi perhatian ya, di isu level Midoreng itu tadi. Ya. Kalau kita lihat, saya rasa sudah makin terungkap kalau sumber untuk berlanjut dan bertahan dan tumbuhnya unsur oligarki baru adalah sumber daya alam. Ya. Jadi, nah sekarang ini nikel, kemudian batu bara, ya. Ya, saya rasa sudah mulai diungkap-ungkap juga bahwa kenapa ini mewakili siapa di kabinet, yang jadi menteri, yang jadi wamen, yang di ini gitu ya. Ya, itu bisa ditarik ke belakang kapan itu terjadi. Jadi kalau saya melihat kalau mau mencoba menawarkan teori di Midoreng ini, salah satunya ya barter politik, ya, yang tumbuh, yang membuat oligark itu makin kuat dan makin bertambah dengan unsur baru, gitu. Saya rasa Mbak Eri yang dulu juga ekonomi politiknya ke sumber daya alam, ya mungkin kita menarik untuk memfollow up fenomena baru ini, ya. Jadi mungkin ada fenomena lain. Tadi Mbak Fardila ini ngomong juga soal media sosial dan media, itu satu fenomena baru yang akhirnya juga dikooptasi oleh oligark itu. Gitu. Jadi ini ajakan saya ya buat Bu Fedi, Prof. Dick Robinson dan lain-lain, ya terutama yang di luar. Coba kita sekarang tingkatkan perhatian pada yang middle range, ya. Karena buat saya, nggak tahu kalau buat yang lain, kalau oligarki, konsep ataupun teori itu sudah established, ya. Menurut saya, mungkin itu aja, ya.
Pak Andrino, saya mencoba menjawab soal SDA itu sumber daya alam dan politik barter. Itu sudah lama terjadi. Dari zaman Orde Baru itu sudah terjadi. Jadi sebenarnya barter politik barter dalam konteks sumber daya alam itu makin lama makin tersolidifikasi. Nah, yang menarik adalah bagaimana misalnya hilirisasi nikel. Itu salah satu contoh dan batu bara ya, sekarang ini. Bagaimana oligark dan kita tahu menterinya adalah ketua partai XYZ. Itu kan permainan relasi kuasa, barter, bahkan kalau boleh, maaf nih kalau boleh menggeneralisasi, komposisi kabinet presiden sekarang itu kan semuanya adalah politik barter. Nah, itu kasat mata sekali. Dan bagaimana jejaring, nah ini bukan hanya orang per orang, jejaring itu. Nah, di SDA lebih kelihatan lagi, tapi ini bukan sesuatu yang baru. Nah pertanyaannya sekarang kan adalah bagaimana caranya merubah itu. Karena kalau tadi bukunya bilang yang tahun 2025-26 reformasi sudah berakhir, ya mungkin 20 tahun lagi mudah-mudahan ya Mas Wedi tidak terjadi ya. 20 tahun lagi bukan hanya reformasi sudah berakhir, tapi bahwa oligarki itu bukan hanya resentralisasi, tapi ditambah dengan barter politik yang semakin hari semakin mengakar. Nah pertanyaannya kan kita nggak mau selesai di situ ya Pak Andrino. Solusinya terus apa? Karena itu juga meningkatkan korupsi, meningkatkan nepotisme. Tadi menarik bahwa Pak Andrino bilang contohnya Gibran gitu. Itu contoh yang paling nyata, tapi sebenarnya banyak sekali contoh-contoh lain. Mau di level wali kota, level bupati, sampai ke level pusat. Nah, pertanyaan yang mungkin perlu kita fokus adalah what next? Gimana caranya mengurai kekuasaan oligarki dengan barter politik, baik di sektor sumber daya alam maupun sektor lainnya, untuk supaya Indonesia ini bisa kembali dalam tanda kutip bernapas. Karena kalau tidak, yang terjadi adalah terus-terusan. Bahkan mohon maaf nih, jejaring CSO pun, ya, perguruan tinggi, organisasi keagamaan, itu juga udah terseret di dalam oligarki di konteks sektor tambang misalnya. Itu kan udah kelihatan tuh. Nah ini bagaimana mengurainya, nah itu Pak Andri loh. Pertanyaan kalau enggak kan nanti sore ini berakhir dengan ya kita pukul-pukul kepala dan pukul-pukul dada, tapi terus berikutnya apa, karena
distribusi antidepresan.
Karena maaf Pak Andri Noh nyebut-nyebut middle ground teori itu juga tidak ada teorinya. Maaf, sependek pengetahuan saya belum ada itu teori untuk bagaimana mengurai ini semua gitu. Karena maaf, teorinya itu udah ketinggalan zaman yang ada sekarang. Nah, teori barunya tidak ada, penelitian lapangannya belum cukup kuat, ya secara akademik juga tidak bisa menjawab gitu. Nah, itu silahkan Mas Fedi.
Saya yang perlu dijawab Mbak Eri. Gini, Anda bicara middle range theory, tapi middle range theory itu kan menangkap observable empirical itu, ya kan? Ya. Itu mesti, kalau buat saya itu harus dikaitkan dengan grand theory, baru it makes sense gitu. And I suppose we work at that level. Walaupun kita juga ini ya bukan berarti nggak ada empiriknya ya, banyak banget empiriknya gitu ya. Tapi dikaitkan dengan grand theoretical formulation gitu ya. Jadi buat kami politik barter yang Anda sebut itu ya adalah simptomatik dari ekonomi politik oligarki yang kami jabarkan tersebut. Bagaimana what next-nya itu, maaf itu Mbak Eri, itu nggak terjadi besok lusa, minggu depan, atau tahun depan, atau 10 tahun lagi. Ya, karena kalau itu adalah simptom dari ekonomi politik tersebut yang harus dijungkalkan. Ya nggak bisa ini barter, ya kalau barter sama bandit ya jadi bandit juga gitu kan. Dan itu banyak orang yang kita barter aja, ya jadi bandit juga akhirnya gitu. Ya, itu yang harus makanya itu yang kita bilang bahwa harus ya itu untuk jangka panjangnya social movementnya itu harus mengembangkan perspektif politik, kapasitas politik sehingga ini ya intinya gini, mungkin agak kasar ya, tapi ginilah intinya. Kalau ekonomi politik oligarki itu hancur karena rongsok secara di dalam dan tekanan dari luar, ya negara harus diambil alih oleh mereka yang punya kepentingan yang sifatnya reformatif. Tapi yang punya kepentingan reformatif itu satu cenderung terkooptasi, kedua tidak menjadi bagian dari organisasi atau gerakan sosial lebih luas yang koheren di mana dia accountable terhadap gerakan sosial tersebut. Nah, gampang aja dikooptasi orang satu persatu. Karena nggak ada basis sosial.
We're talking about the AFL.
I've been thinking that the term oligarchy can apply to any country in different ways. You know, I think the main thing is to focus on oligarchy as a system, as a social order, rather than the behaviour of individuals or that. And I think you have an oligarchy, a system of oligarchic power. It might not be popular, but millions of people are tied into it, and they depend on it, even at the very bottom levels. They depend on it. If you want to get a contract, you know what to do. It's no use standing up and saying, I'm not going to do that, you know, because this systemic set of relationships is in power. And how do you stop that? Well, people like Max Weber and Marx, and they said, well, when industrialization comes, the investors will demand certainty, predictability, that sort of thing. Well, that happened in the early stages of it, but now they don't need that. Successful businesses don't need certainty or predictability. You look at in America, right? The people like Thiel and Musk and that, they want the opposite. They want disorder and disorganization and that. So I think that thinking in terms of structures is important here. And around those structures, you can put clothes on those structures. But the other thing is that thinking that if you want to change things, there are a lot of people who won't want to change, even though they hate the system, because they're frightened of letting loose, and particularly the people at the bottom, because that's all they've got.
Pertanyaan dari Mbak Heri penting, what next ini. Kemudian soal bahwa kita harus punya pemahaman struktural itu 100%, kalau perlu 1000% saya setuju. Bahwa apa yang kita angkat itu disebut simptom semata, itu mungkin perlu kita diskusikan. Nah, oke, sekarang bicara soal solusi. Yang ingin saya sampaikan begini, bahwa sumber utama sekarang ini secara material itu adalah sumber daya alam untuk pembiayaan bertahannya oligarki dan membesarnya oligarki. Maka pertanyaannya bagaimana mengerem sumber itu, ngambil sumber itu, kan begitu. Nah, saya kan sering melontarkan bahwa ini nggak benar nih penentuan royalti yang cuma 10% untuk batu bara, nikel cuma 2-4%. Karena itu kita wacanakan supaya bahwa orang tahu ini adalah pelanggaran dari konstitusi, pasal 33 ayat 3. Tapi kalau ini menjadikan gerakan civil society kan bisa, gerakan akademik kan bisa gitu. Jadi maksud saya, mohon maaf, di dalam ini, di bawah ini banyak yang kita belum utak-atik begitu. Oke, itu aja poinnya. Makasih, sorry saya mengganggu ya.
Terima kasih. Satu lagi tadi, 1 minute free ya.
Ya, ini sebenarnya melanjutkan apa yang dibilang Bang Andrinov tadi gitu, perkara tentang bagaimana memahami nitty-gritty proses politik yang terjadi dalam konteks oligarki gitu. Karena yang jadi masalah saya dengan, walau saya setuju ya bahwa yang bisa dibilang sekarang adalah ada pendalaman gitu ya, bisa dibilang pendalaman kronik kapitalisme gitu, di mana rente coba diproduksi lewat kekuasaan negara dalam rangka untuk memenuhi klien-klien yang semakin besar ini ya. Cuman masalahnya adalah, dan ini problem yang saya setuju dengan Bang Andrinov di sini, ada proses yang seringkali nggak bisa di-capture sama problem oligarki gitu. Misalkan kalau ini pada sebatas rente, kenapa dia harus katakanlah membuat BI menjadi semakin dependen sama politik negara gitu, dengan memutuskan adanya burden sharing antara BI dengan Kemenkyu gitu. Padahal karena konsekuensi dari institutional change ini adalah dia justru menciptakan musuh yang menciptakan destabilisasi bagi oligarki rule itu sendiri gitu. Sedangkan salah satu premis yang penting dari hubungan bagi-bagi patron klien yang tercipta dalam oligarki kan menciptakan stabilisasi.
Akhirnya sudah, sorry.
Oke deh,
Sorry
ya deh kalau gitu.
Karena
Mungkin itu
kita
aja sih
sudah-
ya.
Ya, ini saya singkat aja. Jadi itu keliru untuk menerjemahkan kita sebagai mengatakan bahwa oligarki itu tidak punya kontradiksi-kontradiksi dan persaingan-persaingan internal. Justru saya dari awal mengatakan itulah yang menjadi motor evolusi dari oligarki tersebut. Ya, kontradiksi-kontradiksi dari dalamnya sendiri. Jadi kalau Anda menunjuk kepada berapa pola di mana institusi-institusi itu kok tidak klop, sepertinya merugikan oligarki sendiri, itu karena oligarki bukan satu orang. Oligarki adalah suatu suatu sistem sosial di mana ada banyak kepentingan gitu loh ya. Dan kepentingan-kepentingan oligarkis itu juga nggak seragam. Keseragaman mereka adalah mempertahankan oligarki. Tetapi di antara mereka bersaing.
Oke, sorry saya tahu masih banyak banget yang ingin berdiskusi tetapi waktu benar-benar sudah habis ya. Sekarang sudah pukul 3.30 jadi mungkin bisa nanti dilanjutkan setelah ini. Mungkin sorry banget. Mungkin jika saya boleh wrap up sangat-sangat singkat yang tentu saja kita tadi sudah dengar ya bahwa sekarang kita masuk ke tahap baru resentralisasi dari oligarki itu dan di dalamnya memang ada kontradiksi-kontradiksi ya yang mungkin saja bisa membuat decay from within dari dalam. Nah, masalahnya adalah apabila itu memang sudah decay, apakah kita lalu siap untuk mengambil alih? Ya, dan itu butuh solidifying yang lumayan dan koordinasi yang lumayan. Oke, maaf karena semua pertanyaan tidak mungkin ditanggapi setidaknya secara publik, tapi give a round of applause, mari kita beri applause untuk ketiga pembicara kita. Oke, saya kembalikan pada MC.
Terima kasih kepada moderator dan seluruh narasumber atas diskusi yang sangat bermanfaat. Sebagai ungkapan terima kasih dan apresiasi atas waktu dan juga pemikiran serta wawasan yang telah dibagikan dalam seminar hari ini, kami akan memasuki sesi pemberian souvenir kepada para narasumber. Untuk itu, kami mengundang Pak Salvatore Simamarta untuk maju ke depan. Terima kasih kepada Bapak Salvatore Simamarta serta para narasumber yang telah berkenan menerima tanda apresiasi dari kami. Selanjutnya, kami mempersilakan untuk foto bersama. Hadirin yang saya hormati, sampailah kita di penghujung acara. Terima kasih telah berpartisipasi aktif dalam kegiatan ini. Kami memohon untuk bantuan Bapak Ibu untuk mengisi formulir evaluasi demi peningkatan kualitas kegiatan kami ke depan. Sebelum meninggalkan ruangan, Terima kasih kepada seluruh narasumber, moderator, serta hadirin yang telah hadir dan berkontribusi pada acara hari ini. Semoga diskusi hari ini memberikan wawasan yang bermanfaat bagi kita semua. Saya Reha Riyadi, pamit undur diri. Sekian, terima kasih.